About 8 or 9 years ago, I moved and had to put some stuff into storage. At the time, I was completely bored of 6th and 7th edition 40k, so I was happy to put a lot of my minis in. I hadn't thought about that in a while, but I just had a chance to go and sort through it, and let me tell you, I had so much more Warhammer than I thought. I've always been more of a work to live kind of person than a live to work kind of person, so I was pretty poor in my 20s. I don't regret that, I had a blast. However, I've just found out the main reason I was so poor. Why did I buy so much Warhammer? 9 Dark Eldar vehicles? Will I use them all in one game? Doesn't matter, got them. I quite like Tau. Hey, guess what? Now I have loads of tanks and Forge World battle suits. What's in this box? Imperial Guard tanks? I don't remember what was going on that I wanted that, being a Xenos lover. Anyway, a deep dive into my hoarding psyche aside, I have a load of Drukhari that I haven't seen since they were still called Dark Eldar. I have a new paint scheme now, and a lot of these weren't finished in the first place, so I need to bring them up to my modern standard. There's enough here that it could end up quite overwhelming if I tried to do it all at once, so I think my best way to start is to focus on the new combat patrol lists, get a simple army I can play my first few games with, and then build on that. First off, I had to strip the minis. They were previously a basic dark green scheme, but I think they have a bright future, if you know what I mean. I filled a Tupperware tub full of isopropyl alcohol. If you're trying to get hold of this, sometimes it's called IPA, sometimes isopropanol. They're all basically the same thing, just 99% alcohol. So I threw in the first batch of minis. After about 20 minutes, you can start with a pipe cleaner, toothbrush, or like a firm paintbrush and start kind of just scrubbing the paint off. Once the majority is done and you're getting some resistance on the remaining paint, you can put them back in and leave them a bit longer. It'll loosen up the rest and just rinse and repeat until they're done. At this point, I also noticed my incubi were a pale grey and it hit me. These models are fine cast. Of course, this collection is way before the plastic kit came out. Do you remember that stuff? Just what a fail. The minis have these weird edges and the bits are all kind of curled over. I just can't. The incubi are getting a basic paint job and they will be the first modern kit I buy once I've got through the mountain of old stuff. My Archon didn't survive the time in storage, so I needed to get a new one. I was considering the current Archon, but I'm not that sure on it. The pose kind of looks to me like he's kind of about to do a trust fall or something. So I returned to my trusty 3D printer. I bet you are wondering if I'd get through a whole video without that thing. And I found a mini I quite liked. The posing is a little static for my taste, so I may make a new one at some point. But this is actually a really good sculpt other than that. I especially like the cool helmet with the kind of skull in between the horns. Now, for the first time ever, I decided to paint the minis separately from the bases, as I wanted to try a kind of cool effect, which we'll get to later. So, while in the repair stage of the project, I pried everyone off their bases and, you guessed it, got to 3D printing some more. To enable me to hold the minis while painting them, I pinned the feet by drilling a hole and supergluing a bit of paperclip in it. I then stuck this into cork as a painting handle. The only issue is I had about 7 corks and 16 dudes. I planned to keep switching them over, putting the ones I was actively painting into corks, but this lasted about 3 switches until I just decided to hold the unlucky ones at the feet. Finally, onto the painting, and I started by priming white and then base coating with Game Air Squid Pink. Now don't worry, I don't plan on painting all versions of my space elves in bright pinks. There's a technique I've been wanting to try for a while with a different bright colour. So once all the minis were mostly pink, I gave them a zenithal with Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White by putting it in the airbrush and selectively spraying from mostly upward angles. I tried to make sure I got more of the mini white with this step than I typically would, but still leaving the pink to act as the downward facing shading. I wanted to deepen what would become the shadows, so I used model colour fluorescent magenta and hit each model from a fully downward angle, beefing up those darker areas. At last I moved on to my main colour, Citadel Iandan Yellow. Because of cool colour theory,
but my mom says I'm cool.
Magenta actually mixes very well with yellow to make vibrant shadows. My first few models were done with the contrast thinned with contrast medium. However, as I went on I realised the colours still mixed with neat Iandan Yellow. So if you try this, don't bother thinning. I ended up going back over the first few models to bring them up anyway. For vehicles, I use the Airbrush. Contrast paints are notoriously bad for covering large, flat surfaces evenly, so this seemed like the simplest way to do it. Contrast paints are actually really nice through an airbrush anyway. Give it a try if you haven't. My secondary colour for these models will be a dark red, so for this I use Citadel Flesh Tearers Red Contrast. I was careful to avoid the already painted areas and just coloured all the soft, non-armoury parts of the main clothing. Because these incubi, these mere fine-cast plebs, don't deserve our attention, I rush through their helmets with Citadel Black Templar contrast. I'll highlight these up eventually, but anything to save times on these guys is worth it. The leader is supposed to have a double sword, but I guess this set didn't come with that, so I differentiate this one by just painting it with Flesh Tearers red again. While filling out the black details, I used a regular black to block out all the weapons and little belt parts that were going to be black, along with a lot of the kind of structural bits on the raiders. Next, I use Fantasy and Games Mayhem Red to block out the sails. This is pretty close to the Flesh Tearers Red, so it should match well, especially once I've done my shading. I then based the metallic parts with Hashut Copper. This was mostly on the weapons, but I included some of the small spiky details and little accessories on the belt. Now I just needed to sort out the vehicles. Because I'd used the airbrush, there was an even coverage over all of the vehicles with nothing kind of settling in the recesses, so it didn't have any natural shading. So I took Citadel Cassandora Yellow, washing the dudes as usual, then panel lining the main vehicle. Panel lining, or pin washing, is where you use a shade only in the parts you want it, so as not to darken or tint any of the main surfaces. Side note, I should have done this in a sub-assembly because there were some hard to reach parts in these vehicles. You can't really blame my impatience for that like you normally could, because leaving these models apart for 9 years in a second paint job would probably be a bit too patient. I then washed the bronze colour with Agrak's Earthshade. This is quite a desaturated colour, but I felt the metallic parts didn't need to be at all bright as the rest of the mini had that job. Now the tertiary colour is a purple, so I used Army Painter Alien Purple. The colour is only meant to act as an accent on most of the minis, and maybe used a bit more liberally on higher ranking soldiers and leaders and that kind of thing. So I painted any of the small cloth bits and hair scrunchies on the warriors, and the tubards on the incubi. I use Citadel Nuln Oil to shade the skin on the one guy. This is pure black, so you wouldn't normally use this for a skin tone, but I thought I'd make their skin and hair super monotone. Maybe that's why they use the bright armour, to deflect from the fact that they're all kind of hollow and stuff like that. Now, to block in another smaller colour, I used Citadel Ushabti Bone on the, you guessed it, bone parts. All those little bits in the skin tabards and a couple of bits in their hair. So next I decided to look at the sails. They were still quite bright red and I wanted them to be quite a lot darker. I decided to do a gradient down to quite a dark black to make them look really contrasty and, you know, like magical. These are flying boats, they're not just regular sails, are they? So on my wet palette I went back to my original Mayhem Red and mixed in like a gradient down to black. So my wet palette I had like the entire range of colours. I just took various gradients of these and layered them up down to a black. I would have just glazed here to smooth out the transitions, but I ended up with a weird rough texture on some of these. It's either because the spray paint was out of use and had some dried bits in the thing, or because I didn't clean off the old flecks of paint well enough. Either way, lesson learned for next time, because it was a bit of a pain in the arse at this stage. So I basically just kept mixing around and going over and over until I had a really smooth gradient. Now, I wanted to get all the main yellow armour basically done so that I could check that the weathering I wanted to do would work out quite nicely before going through everything else. A quick note about this, I did this part right at the start here because I wanted to do if I'd need to do any edge highlighting and avoid wasting time highlighting the bits that would be covered anyway. However, in the future I'm going to change this to be right at the end, because if I want to put any decals on the main body I'll need to scratch those underneath the weathering as well. Anyway, I used Citadel Rhinox hide and chopped up a sponge. I used a cable tie to keep tweezers clamped and then dabbed it lightly in the paint. I dabbed most of it off so I was getting only patchy, dotty little patterns, and then stippled unevenly across the edges of panels and the parts sticking out. I want the vehicles to be really weathered, so I went to town on this. Now, these vehicles are made to be fast and destructive, and as such, I wanted to give the impression that they'd been tearing through a battlefield, through debris and bullets and whatever else. I had an idea that kind of worked out. I chopped an old brush unevenly, you know, like the way the barber does where they cut kind of perpendicular to your hair so that it kind of looks more natural and not like it's a straight line that's just been cut You know what I'm talking about. Then I wetted the brush and took a lighter to the remaining bristles. I was trying to get them to curl up and cause a really random pattern. It did kind of harden up the bristles and cause them to just not take as much paint in, but it kind of worked. At least it gave me a scratchy texture. That was fine, really. I swiped it across the front and side facing areas, the parts that would have been ploughing through the random battlefield crap. After this stage was done, I used game colour silver to mark out the areas where the damage might have got down to the base metal. With a smallish brush, I filled in the larger areas of brown, leaving it as an outline to the silver. I also used it as a sort of edge highlight for any brown areas. I did this on both types of damage, the stippled dotty stuff and the long swipey stuff. I decided to also do some regular edge highlighting to further define panels and armour edges where there wasn't any damage. I mixed model colour golden yellow and bold titanium white 50-50 and did this in a really scratchy, uneven way to further push the idea of minor scrapes amongst the big damage. I don't like edge highlighting, so 16 dudes and 2 vehicles was trying. Once it was finally done, I added to my paint by putting even more white in the mix and going over any corners or where scratches hit the edge of the panels. This was a bit less tedious because there was less to do and definitely pushed the effect into looking really awesome. I hate edge highlighting, but I can't deny its efficacy. So that's the armour fully done and the majority of the edge highlighting out of the way. Next I focused on the bronze, going back to Hashut copper to re-establish the base tone. I painted direct from the pot as this was another part that had gained that rough texture, and I was hoping I could kind of cover that up with thicker paint. Using undiluted paint to smooth over details is a technique normally known in the industry as fucking up. I painted this everywhere except the recesses, leaving the shade in those areas. I then added some game colour silver, about 2 parts copper to 1 part silver, and went over a large portion of these areas. I was starting to feel that the bronze was too similar in tone to the orangey yellows, and it was getting a bit lost, so I decided I wanted to make it a fair bit paler. I hoped this would make it stand out more and add some more visual interest. So therefore I made sure to take the majority of these parts into this more silvery brassy colour. I used a brush carefully for the flat or smooth round surfaces, but gave a quick dry brush to any chains or areas that had some nice detail sculpted. Finally, I made a mix of mostly silver with just a small amount of the copper and highlighted the edges and the upward facing areas. With the yellow and brass done, I moved on to the black parts. I used Mechanica Standard Grey, which, by the way, was one of the things in storage. It's crazy how paints just last. I thought everything would be dry in that box. Anyway, I started with a quick dry brush on the Incubi helmets, because never mind those guys. I then edge highlighted all the weapons and black parts of the vehicles. After this I took model colour medium sea grey to bring the very edges and corners to a lighter tone, just finishing off that edge highlighting for those, and also a little bit of dry brushing on the Incubi. I washed the bone parts with Agrax Earthshade, used Nuln Oil to shade down the red to a tone I was more happy with, and then used Drakenhof Nightshade to shade all the purple parts. I next focused on the purple, re-establishing the basic tone with Alien Purple. I highlighted this with a 50-50 mix of purple and golden yellow, tying the highlights into the main tone. I highlighted the bone parts with Game Colour Bone White, using the paint very slightly watered down and running the brush towards the area I wanted, usually the ends, to create a simple gradient. Then I highlighted the red areas sparingly with Game Colour Bloody Red. This was mostly just an edge highlight as I had the main tones where I wanted them, just needed them to get a bit of definition. Okay, there are a few details left over and my patience was waning fast. With an overall army paint job such as this, those smaller details really won't be looked at particularly closely, so I decided to save my time and sanity and just gave them a very quick pass with Citadel Gore Gruntifer contrast. For the guy with his face out, I washed it with a Citadel Beal Tan Green so it would look fully unnatural, then I highlighted that up with white. I finished off with the eyes and decided to try something different. Most eyes I do, I'll kind of spill the paint to the surrounding surfaces to give a glow effect, but this time I simply filled the socket with Drakenhof Nightshade, highlighted with a bit of alien purple, then gave a reflective dot with the white. I wanted to see how these would look as kind of simple, quite dark, just glass lenses, as the rest of the model was so bright, and I think it actually worked really well. As one last touch, I put a sigil on the Raider. It's a symbol I just quickly designed for my custom Cabal, which I'll maybe spend some more time on later on. I didn't want to spend too much time on this mass painting, so I only did one on each vehicle. With that part done, I'm calling this project finished for now, ready to go out and pillage real space. So this is the end result, a full combat patrol ready for some battle reports. What do you think of this colour? I love the typical Dark Eldar scheme where it's dark with quite bright highlights to give that ethereal colour, but I also really like colours that are quite bright or quite pale and just kind of go against that as well. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the battle report next week.